Agrochemicals such as fertilizers, pesticides, and insecticides are used in agriculture to facilitate plant growth and protection. However, environmental and agriculture experts have warned that excessive use of such chemicals has potential to harm the environment and the crops. This week on News in Depth, Macpherson Mukoka looks at management of agrochemicals and disposal of empty chemical containers. I'm your host, Masauso Mukwayaya. Stay tuned.
A month-old leafy green tomato seedling under the morning sunlight rays is fed by drops of water from a drip irrigation system at a farm in Lusaka West area. If properly nurtured, this seedling and many others on this field will soon grow into fully matured plants like these other 27,000 fruiting tomato plants on a 1.5 acre field. For these plants to fully mature and produce market-ready tomatoes, they require critical care and nurturing. Before these seedlings are transplanted, the land on which they are grown is cleared, plowed, and disinfected. Some of these land and plant preparation methods require the use of chemicals to deal with unwanted elements such as weeds or insects. Agrochemicals, such as fertilizers, are also used to aid the growth of plants at various stages of maturity. The chemicals are largely meant to improve crop yields.
When we talk of pesticides, we are looking at those chemicals we use to manage the weeds. Those will be herbicides. There are those pesticides or chemicals we use to control insect infestation. And also there are a lot of other chemicals we use to manage bacteria or fungi which might attack the crop. And in addition to chemicals which will be able to control pests, we also have chemicals which contribute to the nutrition status of the soil. So fertilizers also are agrochemicals. So it is the fertilizers which we use to promote the normal growth of the crop, and also the chemicals which we use to protect the crop from attack in terms of insects and other pathogens.
Ruth Kangwa and her husband Emmanuel Ndilovu has been farming since 2013. Mr. Ndilovu is an agronomist who, together with his wife, are trying to make farming into a lucrative business. Ruth, the budding young farmer, is a graduate of human rights law. She says she uses different agrochemicals to control pests and enhance productivity in her maize and tomato fields.
Usually our use for the agrochemicals is to control mostly pests that may arise and come about from the crops that we have. If it's a tomato or the cabbage that we'll have, there'll be tutors, and we'll certainly need to use any of the pesticides, the fungicides, and the insecticides to really ensure that our crop is kept well and to ensure that we produce the best quality as we are going to market it at Soweto Market. And some of the uses that we've also noted is that the main benefits of pesticides is to help increase the crop yield of our produce.
Ruth is definitely not the only farmer using agrochemicals in her fields. The National Association of Smallholder Farmers notes that the majority of farmers in Zambia use agrochemicals. Association Executive Director Frank Kayura says many of the farmers using agrochemicals are those who depend on irrigation.
In Zambia, the majority of those that are using weed control pests are those that are going for soybeans and maize, and under usually what we call conservation agriculture. Those have been trained very well on how to use these pesticides so that they are able to clean the fields and are able to ensure that the crop does not compete with the weeds or the insects or the diseases themselves as they are growing. But what we have also noticed as an association for smallholder farmers is that majority of those that use chemicals off these two main crops I've mentioned are those that are engaged in irrigation, particularly growing of tomato, growing of cabbages, and growing of those what we can call green products that are sold green.
The Environmental Management Act of 2011 empowers Zambia Environmental Management Agency, ZEMA, to provide guidelines for the management, storage, transportation, spillage, and disposal of agrochemical waste. The administration of agrochemicals involves a wide range of equipment from aircraft to self-propelled sprayers, manually operated sprayers, and by hand.
We actually look at the life cycle of a chemical from the time it's manufactured, how you store it, the way you transport, and the way it is used. So we are actually promoting at any given stage a message that focuses on safe use. Our focus has been to train agro dealers. I'm sure you are aware that these chemicals are brought into the country by these agro dealers, and there are people that interface with farmers. So our main message there is to ensure that they know the type of chemicals, the dangers those chemicals might pose both to human health and the environment.
Despite the positive contribution of agrochemicals in improving crop yields, experts advise against overusing the chemicals as they have a negative effect on the environment. The Zambia Agricultural Research Institute, ZARI, disclosed that many of these chemical elements are poisonous or harmful to humans, livestock, and wildlife. This is because most of the said products have toxic and corrosive effects.
If we don't also use those pesticides wisely or according to how it is prescribed by those who produce the chemicals, we can also be affected. Because the same way it will affect those other living organisms, even the one who's applying can also be at risk. And beyond that, we find that when you are not using pesticides in the right manner, you find that some of the pesticides might remain in the crop. Then you have some residue effect. Those people are going to eat that vegetable or that cereal or those crops. They will be eaten together with the remains of those pesticides. So pesticide management is very critical, because it all takes about the farmer ensuring that you use the correct dosage, you apply at the right time, and ensure that you harvest at the right time. And also after application, you don't move around in the field, so that you don't come in contact with the pesticides, which is poisonous.
Some agrochemicals, such as pesticides, are extremely hazardous to the health of users and the general public, and also to the environment. The Zambia National Public Health Institute, ZNPHI, a parastatal body under the ambits of the Ministry of Health, feels lack of labeling chemical containers in local languages contributes to the health complications in users. Aubrey Chewe, a field epidemiologist, says most people in rural areas who may not be able to read the instructions written in English risk getting exposed to the poison.
We have had a situation where most of these chemicals are imported into the country. Later on, they are pre-packaged by the supplier, and even when they are pre-packaged, the labeling is done in English, and later on we discover that the people who are going to be the end users do not so much understand the language that has been used in labeling. So there's always also a requirement by by the supplier to also look at the people who are going to use these chemicals and have them labeled in the language that they are going to understand. In our setup, the 7 languages would be key.
Ruth shares similar sentiments with Mr. Chewe. She, however, notes that most of the chemicals are imported and require additional effort from the local suppliers to do the translations in local languages.
We have to also note and be very realistic that some of these agrochemicals aren't even manufactured or produced here in Zambia. Some come as far as from India or Bangladesh, but it would be nice as we are importing, maybe there's a little key guideline or translation of how to manage and use these agrochemical products, but translate them into local languages. And I believe that work would then come from the Zambian end, because usually we are importing these products and we don't really have, or we have little to many companies that are producing chemicals locally.
Safety and health in the use of agrochemicals has been one of the primary concerns among different stakeholders. ZEMA Principal Inspector Pesticide and Toxic Substances, Christopher Kanema, explains that some farmers fail to follow laid down procedures in using the chemicals. He says this has resulted in an increase in the number of community poisoning cases.
Currently working with the Food Agriculture Organization, where we have to identify what we call the highly hazardous pesticides. These are pesticides that have been found to either cause cancer, others might cause nuisance in the communities. I think you are aware that the levels of poisoning in the community is also of concern. So there are a number of cases that we are seeing increasing in terms of poisoning. This can be intentional or even accidental poisoning. So we are going around to check with the farmers and see which chemicals are causing such kind of damage to the community. So the idea is to come up with a policy either to ban or restrict some of the use of such chemicals.
Agrochemicals have an environmental effect on land, water, and soil. The contamination on the above-named natural resources is due to excessive use of different chemicals. Overuse of these processed chemical compounds ends up compromising the quality of the soil. This further compromises the quality of crops, which ultimately affects production.
Over time, the residue effect of these chemicals on the soil can also be detrimental, because you find that in future, if you are using chemicals like atrazine, you have challenges in certain plants growing, especially dicotyledons, because their germination is also impaired. You find that where you had applied atrazine, the germination of okra is really poor, or even these beans. So the management and use of chemicals is very, very important, and farmers, in as much as they could like to use chemicals, they should be able to ensure that they use the safe chemicals, and at times it's also important to blend these the modern chemicals with alternative means. Where the infestation is not so strong, you could also try and use extracts of neem or extracts of these are botanical products.
The young Lusaka West farmer is aware of the effects of agrochemicals on the soil and their impact on crop production. She, however, notes that not all farmers are aware of this environmental effect.
Certainly, I believe that there's a lack of sensitization, and it would be very nice to see extension workers, especially from the Ministry of Agriculture, because I'd like to believe most of them are agronomists or are well versed in agricultural studies, that they go around sensitizing how best to use or even to dispose of agrochemicals. So the challenge comes in with us farmers using our, I call it self-based or learning DIY knowledge of these agrochemicals, but you find that we are finding ourselves in instances where we don't dispose of these agrochemicals without affecting the environment that we live in.
Another environmental concern of using agrochemicals emanates from the failure to manage and dispose of different chemical package materials. The Association for Smallholder Farmers feels there is an information gap regarding management and disposal of empty chemical containers.
We have had situations where a farmer doesn't know at what rate to apply the chemical, or let alone what chemical should I use, and what is the dilution rate for this chemical, what is the safe period for the chemical. Those are challenges that needs to be looked at as much as possible, and we need to improve as much as possible the information flow. I know that you are there as media. We need to make use of you as much as possible. The media houses, we can do brochures in English and local language so that farmers understand what chemical am I going to use for a particular problem? How do I scout for these problems? How do I dilute these chemicals and things like that?
The Zambia National Farmers Union, ZNFU, on the other hand, says information may be available, but the challenge remains with the farmers to adhere to the guidelines. ZNFU Public Relations Manager Calvin Kalei says the union, who, however, continue to interact with the farmers to ensure they have the right information regarding management and disposal of agrochemicals.
We engage our farmers, we talk to our farmers to to manage the chemicals very well, and also how they are going to dispose of the containers that they have used, where they have decanted the chemicals from. But obviously, there are certain standards that we have to meet, and these standards are not set by us as Zambia National Farmers Union. These standards are set by the Zambia Environmental Management Authority, ZIMA, and we've been working very, very closely with ZIMA to furnish us with those standards. We have attended meetings with them. They've been submitting articles on issues of standards on how to dispose of, how to handle chemicals, how to dispose of containers, and so on.
ZEMA also discloses that management and disposal of empty chemical containers remains a major source of concern, which the agency is working hard to address. Principal Inspector Pesticide and Toxic Substances, Christopher Kanema, says the experience in the field shows that most farmers either burn or bury the empty containers.
There are different forms of disposal that farmers have adopted. Some are throwing containers in the pit latrines, others are burying, others are burning them, and so forth. These practices were allowed at some point, like burning and burying. But what we've noticed over the years is that those chemical containers, they take long to actually break down in the soil, and some of them are quite persistent. And the other issue, when you talk about burning, you are releasing what we call toxic substances like dioxins and furans. These have been identified as causing harmful effects on human health and the environment. So we discourage the issue of burning.
Meanwhile, Zari says empty chemical containers have to be disposed of in a very careful manner. Zari Principal Agricultural Research Officer Robert Salati says indiscriminate disposal of empty containers can lead to poisoning.
The containers where we package or where these vendors who supply chemicals put have to be managed in a very wise manner, because if they are left unattended, can lead to pollution in terms of the field or the environment. So the management of the empty containers after use is very, very critical. And working with the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, they have come up with some law which requires that the producers of these chemicals should be able to have a recall of some of these containers. So some of the containers which farmers use, they after use, farmers are able to take them back to the agro dealer, and the supplier or the manufacturer will be able to mop them from the community, and there's a way in which they are going to safely dispose them of.
In view of the foregoing challenges, practical measures to eliminate or minimize the harmful effects of agrochemicals are being put in place. The Association of Smallholder Farmers and ZNFU are encouraging their members to engage in organic farming as an environmentally friendly practice.
In Zambia, we need as much as possible to put in policies that will ensure that organic fertilizers come in cheaply and reach farmers cheaply. Farmers have a tendency of putting fertilizer in the mouth to test. When they find that the taste is not bitter, saltish, they say, no, this is not good fertilizer. Of course, if they are dealing with purely organic fertilizer, it may not taste that acidic or sourish. It will not.
Organic is obviously the way to go, but if you want to control certain things, if you want to be efficient, you have to use certain mechanisms for you to be efficient and for you to be more productive on your farm. For small-scale farmers, they could use knapsack sprayers and so on, but it's a bit slow. So you find if you want to control African migratory locusts, you have to spray, you have to do overhead spraying, so that, because they move very quickly. They move very quickly, so you have to spray overhead so that they're easily controlled. Again, that is a chemical that is used. There's a chemical that is used to control that.
ZEMA is also working with the Ministry of Health to sensitize farmers on safe use and disposal of agrochemical waste. Recycling of empty chemical containers is also being promoted.
We've noticed that these chemicals, or the chemical containers, are used in rural areas. Some are using them to store salt, mealie meal. Some they are using them to store water, you know. So because of the residue in there, people are exposed to chemicals. So to avoid such, we want them to puncture them. Okay, so when they are punctured, then you keep them safe, and then the recyclers can pick them now to take them to a recycling plant. What we are promoting now is that the recycling industry is growing in Zambia, and empty pesticide containers are one channel where you can get a resource and recycle. But in the recycling, our condition to the recyclers is that they can only produce products that are like products which are non-consumable products. For instance, conduit pipes.
And the Zambia National Public Health Institute field epidemiologist still emphasizes the need to have user instruction labeled in local languages for each region as provided for in the EMA Act.
It would be good for us to go further by making sure that if these chemicals are being sold in an area like Kasama, they are also labeled in Bemba. If it's in Chipata, they are labeled in Nyanja. If it's in Western Province, they are labeled in Lozi. Northwestern, they are labeled in Irunda, Luvale, as well as Kaonde. If it's in the Southern Province, they are labeled in Tonga. And also making sure that we also monitor at household level what is it that is happening, especially when it comes to empty containers and used containers, so that at the end of the day, we are able to give the responsibility and accountability to the people who are actually benefiting much from the sales of this.
For Zari, farmers are being encouraged to practice integrated pest management by planting crops that control pests.
One of the issues you do in integrated pest management is to ensure that you reduce the pressure of infestation. You can ensure that you plant early, so by the time the weeds are growing, your crop could have reached a stage where it can be able to resist the initial attacks. And also we are talking of intercropping. When you intercrop crops like chili with some vegetables, they become a deterrent. So certain crops are able to deter certain pests. So you'll be able to ensure that you don't use a lot of pests. In any case, the use of pesticides or agrochemicals, or rather pesticides or insecticides, is the last resort, where you know that one, nature has failed to control, because every pest has a natural enemy. So if the natural enemy has depopulated, then we have challenges.
For Ruth, having learned the best practices, burning of empty chemical containers is now a thing of the past.
Back in the day when we weren't very well versed, I mean, we are young farmers, but we've now learned, we used to burn. Just get the containers, burn them. But those fumes end up having an adverse effect on the air, and that would be air pollution. So even how we dispose now is to ensure that we rinse our containers 3 times if we're using them 3 times, and we store them in a sack of containers depending, and we're able to remit them to the people that are into recycling.
The Zambia Environmental Management Agency, ZEMA, and stakeholders in the agriculture sector have developed a manual which provides guidelines on the importation, transportation, handling, and disposal of agrochemicals. The guidelines provided should play a significant role in ensuring that agrochemicals are used safely and without unnecessary risks to people and the environment. Zambia Environmental Management Agency, Zambia National Public Health Institute, Zambia National Farmers Union, National Association of Smallholder Farmers, the farmers themselves, and workers have a fundamental role of educating agrochemical users on the hazards of the substances they handle.
This is where we come to the end of this week's edition of News in Depth, where we have been looking at management of agrochemicals and disposal of empty chemical containers. Make a date with us next time at the very same time as we bring to you another News in Depth documentary. I have been your host, Masauso Mukwayaya. Compliments of the season, pleasant viewing.